If I put a sponge on a table and pour water on the sponge will get wet, and then eventually most of the water will come out of the sponge, and some of it will stay in the sponge because the sponge is good at hanging on to water. That's kind of the ideal situation you want in your garden. You want the kind of soil that hangs on to water but also lets it through and lets it out. Hey, it's Greg here with MaritimeGardening.com, and I thought I'd come out today and speak to one of my viewer questions. And this is a longtime viewer, Dwayne Brown. And I'm in the Maritime Gardening wind studio, outdoor wind studio. It's a windy day today, so it's not a good day for recording, but I had a few minutes to answer this question, so I thought I'd go at it. So his question, I'm going to paraphrase here, but the gist of the question was, your soil looks loose. Mine's wetter. Why is your soil so loose? Why is my soil so wet? So let's just assume that he means that he doesn't have a problem with the soil being compacted. Let's just assume he's got good soil. It just happens to be wet all the time. I'm guessing he's saying it's too wet, right? It was wet soil, too wet. So it's a wet soil, too wet. So why is that the case? And I guess where we'd have to naturally go with that is, what can you do about it? So I've drawn some diagrams, right? We're using my kids' colored pencils because we're high tech here at Maritime Gardening to try to answer this sort of stuff. So, but the first thing to remember, and I would recommend watching the podcast, watch the entire thing that I did with Keith Reed, and the title of it was "Speaking Moistly with Keith Reed," which is a play on words on something the Prime Minister of Canada said once by mistake, that you ever just type in Justin Trudeau speaking moistly on YouTube. Some guy in Alberta made a great video montage about that. But anyway, I digress. The main thing that came out of the conversation that you probably would take away from when I talked to Keith Reed, who's a soil scientist, is to think of the soil. We think of the soil as dirt or, solid material. But another way to think of the soil is a soil solution. Instead of thinking it as pieces of stuff with some water, think of it as water with pieces of stuff, right? And so if you think about it that way, think of it like the soil in your garden like a big sponge, right? Some sponges hang on to water better than other sponges because of the structure of the sponge, right? And some sponges, if I put a sponge in a bucket and I fill the bucket full of water, the sponge is never going to lose its water. If I put a sponge on a table and pour water on the sponge will get wet, and then eventually most of the water will come out of the sponge, and some of it will stay in the sponge because the sponge is good at hanging on to water. That's kind of the ideal situation you want in your garden. You want the kind of soil that hangs on to water but also lets it through and lets it out. And you want the kind of garden that's set up, if you're thinking about the lay of the land, right? The soil design, the design of the garden and how everything's laid out and everything underneath the soil. You want the water to have some place to go. So so to think about it that way, your soil composition affects how the soil solution behaves, right? It affects how the soil. Every once in a while it's going to rain, or you're going to water your soil, and your soil composition is going to affect how your soil lets the water in, how it lets it through, and how much water it hangs on to once the water's gone through it, if the water can actually get through it and off to somewhere else. So I got a diagram here. Which one? This one here. These are going to blow away if I'm not careful. So this diagram here is how my garden is sort of set up, right? I'm trying to do this in reverse. I have some beds that are above the ground. Very few of my beds are any higher than 6 inches above grade in terms of the soil, right? The soil, the box might be 12 inches high, but the soil level is usually only, a few inches above, like 6 inches above grade. And I got some beds that are actually at grade, right? The soil is the same level as the ground, and actually, the bed goes down into the ground. The plant's roots are actually going down into the ground below grade, right? This line across the top here being grade, right? So some of my plants the soil's above grade and the roots go down to grade, maybe a little bit below grade, right? Some of them are like that. But any given soil system, at least to my understanding, right, you've got your soil, right, and you've got different, I'm oversimplifying here, but you've got different grades, right? There's the topsoil, and then there's, the very, there's, we can get very sophisticated with this, but basically there's the kind of soil that water goes through, and then eventually you're going to hit this stuff that is really stuff that water doesn't go through very well. It's still soil, but it's packed so hard, it's got so much weight on it, and centuries and eons of rain, ice, snow, ice ages, all that sort of stuff, right? That it's almost like a rock. And you can call that the hard pan, right? So the hard pan will accept water. It's porous to an extent, right? Water will go through it, but not very much. What water tends to want to do, it's gonna rain. The water. It's gonna see the arrows here, the blue arrows. It's gonna rain, and the water's gonna go down. It's gonna hit your hard pan. And with my garden, because my garden's on a bit of a slope, just a slight slope. So what happens is this is all backwards. I'm looking at the camera screen trying to look at this at the same time. But so the water comes down, then hits the hard pan, and it goes along it and down and away, because my garden's on a bit of a slope. Most places in my garden, when you're up here, if you drop a beach ball on the ground, it's going to roll that way, right? Because my garden's on a slight slope. So I assume the hard pan is traveling on a parallel slope downhill, right? So the water goes down, through, and over and away. Well, because I've got pretty good soil, because of all the things I do as a no-till gardener, keeping the soil mulched, keeping the soil organisms happy, right? Constantly adding organic matter to the soil, not working it in, just adding it on top. And some of my beds are hugelkultur beds, which are, it's a whole nother conversation. I'll probably take that up towards the end of this video. But because I've got that good soil, it holds onto the water, right? So you can see the little blue dots, right? My soil, even though once the water goes down and out, you get a big rain, the soil hangs on to water like a sponge. And that's the water your plants are using, right? Now, what may be the case in your situation, I don't know if you've got beds above grade or if you've got beds at grade, but it's possible that your garden is not on a slope, right? It's flat. It's on a flat piece of ground. You notice how here the hard pan, you can tell it's on there's an angle there, right? So I've drawn this to be flat, right? So your water, the water comes down when it rains, it's got nowhere to go. This is just my best guess of what your situation is. I got another scenario I think might be your problem too, aside from just your soil being the kind of soil that doesn't let the water through. It's very possible your soil just isn't letting the water through, but let's assume you've got reasonably good soil and it's letting the water through. It's possible it's just flat where you are. And so where is this water going to go? It has to go into the hard pan, and it's going to have a hard time doing that. It's going to take time to do that. So anytime there's a really good rain, or if you're, letting the hose go or sprinkler or whatever you're doing, if you don't get rain, I think this guy's in Atlanta, Georgia, someplace like that. So I don't think, he probably doesn't get the same amount of rain I get. I don't know. I don't really know much about Georgia. I've only been there once, and I was only sort of passing through. But so, this water has got to go somewhere. It's got to go into the hard pan. And I've tried to represent that. See the hard pan here with the little blue dots, right? The water is going to penetrate the hard pan. But in a system like this, most of that, I've got a couple of blue dots, I think, that I drew in the hard pan here, but very little of it's penetrating the hard pan because it's got a place to go. It's going that way, right? In this situation here, the water just has to get down, continue to go down in the hard pan. So it gets jammed up trying to pull that off. So it accumulates in your soil. And depending on how far your grade is from the hard pan, that can affect how much water there is in the soil. Imagine this hard pan level was that much higher, like up where the tip of my finger is, right? Notice how I've made it more blue here because this is where the water's gathering. So you get a good rain, you're going to have a lot of water, and it's going to slowly work its way down because it's like a giant swimming pool under your ground, right? So that could be what your problem is. And you've got two solutions there, and that is to, raise your beds a little bit. Just bring them up a little bit, right? And the best way to do that would be the hugelkultur method, right? Dig, that way you don't have to buy any soil. Dig a bunch of that soil up, throw a bunch of rotten logs and debris and stuff like that in the trench, and then put the soil back on top and fill up a box, right? And that way the soil in your garden is still connected to the soil in the ground. The logs you've put in the ground can absorb water and provide that to your plants that are growing up there. But your bed isn't sitting down in the ground like this. See how I've drawn this one here, right? It's got a lot of water in it because it's down in this, saturated soil. So if you bring it up, like this one is, it's not going to have as much, you're not going to have that problem, right? I don't need to do that here, right? Either kind of bed works for me, and I tend to find I get better results with this kind, actually. Because my water's got a place to go, right? So both of these work for me, both approaches, and I find I actually have to, anything on plant that likes a lot of water, I tend to put them in the beds at grade because it's just closer to the soil, the water's in the soil, right? So it just works better. Okay, so that's one solution. That or irrigating, right? You could just dig a trench down the center of your garden, or put some weeping tile or, big O pipe or whatever, some sort of trenching type system, a French drain, there's all kinds of different systems, but you could basically mimic, right, my water has a place to go, so dig a trench, put some sort of weeping tile in or a French drain or something like that, give your water a place to go, and that might solve it as well. But I think it's a lot less work. It really depends on the scale you're gardening on and all that sort of stuff. You have to make a decision for yourself. What's more or less work? Raising your beds, or putting in some sort of irrigation ditch. Not an irrigation ditch to bring the water in, but an irrigation ditch to bring the water out, sort of thing. A drainage ditch, I guess, is the correct term, right? So that's one solution. Now here's another. Now, let's step back here on scale and think about my garden. My garden, there's a big hill, so a lot of water comes down this hill and goes to my garden. But then there's another hill, if you've seen my videos and you see the way my garden's laid out, it's basically it's adjacent to a south-facing slope, right? There's the sun over there. It's on a south-facing slope, but it continues to slope down. Boy, it's hard to do this in reverse. It continues to slope downwards, right, over here, and then the slope runs, right off. It continues to go down. So my garden is on a slightly sloping plateau, right? This is my 2,500 square foot garden. I think we're panning out in scale, right? So the rain comes, it goes down, it follows a hard pan, and the rain goes away, right? And the soil hangs on to the water. That's my garden, so I don't have any real problems, even though I live in a pretty rainy place. It's possible you have a yard, and it's possible that if you think about, your yard, your neighbor's yard, your neighborhood, where your yard is positioned relative to the neighborhood, or where your garden is positioned relative to your yard, it may just be that your garden is at a low point. Notice how I've made it a bit higher over here and a bit higher over here, right? And assuming the hard pan sort of follows the same contour, right? Your garden is basically where the water pools. Even if it isn't pooling on top of the soil, right? Remember, the ground's like a giant bucket, right? Because the hard pan is hard. So the water could be pooling beneath the ground because it's having a hard time. It's got nowhere to go other than into the hard pan, so it's taking its time being absorbed, working its way into the hard pan. So it's accumulating in your soil and you're getting a lot of water in your soil. So that could be your situation. And cause I'm just trying to guess what might be the problem, aside from you just having the kind of soil that's, let's say it's got a lot of clay in it. Clay soil can hold on to water a lot too. But that could be your problem. So again, if this is your problem, you either need to dig some sort of ditch to give the water a place to go, or just raise your beds up a little bit. Try different heights. I would just start with something simple like raising them 6 inches and see how that works. I think in most cases, I mean, a lot of these people with their raised beds, they go way too high. I was just talking to a person at work, and she was saying she wants to build raised beds, and she was flabbergasted at the fact that it's going to cost her $300 a bed. And I'm like, what in the hell are you building these things out of? Gold? Like, you know, a raised bed should cost like 20 bucks. You know, a 4x8 raised bed, right? 2x6 by 8 feet long is all you need to make a raised bed, right? Make a box, dig up all the soil, throw a bunch of rotten logs and, you know, whatever, you know, fill the trench with stuff, put the soil back in, boom, raised bed. Or buy a bunch of soil and fill the raised bed. You know, 6 inches, 6-inch high is most, you know, it rains a lot where I live, you know, but yeah, you know, maybe just the case that where you have your garden set up is not a swamp, but it's kind of swampy underneath, and that's making your soil a bit wet. All right, so, I mean, that's the best diagnosis I can give you, what might be the problem with your garden, and some, you know, really just raising your beds is the easy way to do it. I got lots of videos. I know, Dwayne, you've seen all of these, but this is for other people watching this. I got lots of videos on simple ways to build hugelkultur beds. That's a way to build a raised bed without necessarily having to buy any soil. A lot of people buy soil, and oftentimes when you buy soil, it's not even any better than the soil you have. It may even be worse. I've noticed when you buy soil, it tends to have a lot of sand and things like that in it, right? Because the people selling you the soil are trying to make money, right? It's more important to them that they make money off of you than you having a great garden. So, you know, if you're building a garden, you know, if you have a garden and you've got pretty decent soil, it's likely you've got better soil than what you would have bought anyway. So you just need to take that soil, move it up a little bit. And you move it up by sticking something underneath the soil that will eventually turn into soil. And you know, rotten logs, yard waste, all that sort of stuff can be, you know, dig a trench, you know, put a box down, dig a trench, throw all that rubbish in there, anything, right? Right, stuff like this. It'll break down eventually, right? There's all kinds of organisms that live in the soil that will break things like that down, from things you can see to things you need a microscope to see. It'll break down eventually. And while it's breaking down, I can tell this is a rotten piece of wood, and it's very spongy. This just happened to be here. If I was strong enough, this is very wet. So if I was strong enough, I could squeeze the water out of this, but just suffice it to say, if I press it against this paper, it's not cooperating. You're just going to have to believe me that you can tell that this is making the paper wet or not. But this is wet like a sponge. Right? So, you know, I'm getting way off topic here, but it's just this, you know, if you're worried about cost, and I know a lot of people are hurting right now financially because of the pandemic and the way it's affecting the job market and economics and that sort of stuff. You don't have to buy soil to make a raised bed. You don't even necessarily have to use lumber to make a raised bed. You can just make a mound, right? You don't have to box it in with lumber. And you don't necessarily have to use lumber if you do want a box. You can use all kinds of different things, right? Use what you can find. I've never understood people that want to spend a lot of money on their garden. Your garden's supposed to give to you, not take, right? Anyway, so yeah, there's some solutions for that. Raise your bed. If you want to save money on soil, and actually if you want to have really good soil, use the hugelkultur method. Aside from the fact that it saves you money, because you don't have to buy soil, all of the organisms that are being drawn to that bed to break down that rotting debris that's beneath your soil, they're just going to make your soil that much better. They're going to improve all the qualities of your soil. I would say maybe 1/4 to 1/3 of the beds in my garden are hugelkultur beds. And any garden I feel didn't perform well in a given year. I got one bed this year that I wasn't happy with, and it's not a hugelkultur bed. My number one solution for a garden bed that isn't performing well, or if I think it's too wet, or if I think there's a problem, is to turn it into a hugelkultur bed. Even if it's, you know, small H hugelkultur, where I just put like a 6-inch layer of rotten logs underneath the soil. Even that seems to make a difference. I think I might even have a video that I did a while ago. I'll look for it and put it up at the end of this, called How to Fix a Problem Garden. And I think the actual problem I diagnosed with that garden was that it was holding on, there was too much water and it was a bit too wet. I didn't like the results I was getting. So I affected a solution that's very much like what I'm suggesting here. So I'll try to remember to put a link to that at the end of this video. I think the title was How to Fix a Problem Garden. I've got like 450 videos, so and a lousy memory. So, but yeah, a raised bed, maybe hugelkultur. Of course, mulching is also good too, because every time it rains, your mulch will swell up and hold a lot of water. So if you have your garden mulched 2-3 inches of stuff, not all the rain will actually go down into your soil, right? Some of it will just get held up. It'll be absorbed by your mulch, because you know, mulching materials vary, but all of them have sponge-like qualities, some more than others. So there's a bit of noise off in the background. There's just construction going on. And it always seems to be when I come out here and the birds are singing, it's a beautiful morning, some giant machine starts up and starts digging something. There's a front-end loader or some damn thing, maybe a quarter click that way. That's what that noise is, so sorry about that. This is just the time I had to make this video. Yeah, so raised bed, hugelkultur, mulching, and your last ditch effort would be some sort of drainage ditch to get the water, give the water a place to go. So I hope that was useful. I hope that helped you solve your problem. You know, it's November. You know, the other day I was out in the garden, some of my soil was frozen. But if you're in Atlanta, Georgia, it's probably not the case. So you've got some time to do that work and get ready for next season. So there's some ideas. I hope they're useful. Please let me know if I gave you any help at all. And anybody out there, if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, subscribe. Check out my podcast, maritimegardening.com. And until next time, get out there, get at it, have fun in your garden. Thanks for watching.